Welcome everyone, and thank you that you decided to spend this time with me and the history of the Soviet television. First of all, I want to introduce myself properly. My name is Egor Sennikov. I'm collaborating with the Institute due to the Ozone network, and it's important to say a bit about my way in researching, because it explains the topic, and it explains a lot about the methods and any ideas about the television. The thing is that originally I'm a political scientist, graduating from High School of Economics in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and also from Central European University in 2017. And after that, I decided that I want to leave academia for a while, so I get back to Russia, and I was involved in many cultural enterprises. I think I was an editor of a cinema critic magazine. I was a film programmer, and I'm still is, and I'm curator. So a big part of my life was devoted to the cinema and event organizing, and also with the cinema studies. And that's practically the reason how I found this topic, because for several years I was really interested in Soviet television, especially in the history of the Soviet television of the 70s and 80s. And honestly, it's quite a complex and versatile topic, because there are plenty of different ways of researching it and analyzing it. And being a political scientist with a profound interest in history, and also being interested in cinema studies, I decided that for me it's really important to find the reasons behind the changes which happened with the Soviet television back in the middle of the 80s, which is usually, usually people, when talk about it, they meant perestroika and perestroika television. And I was interested in this from both cinematic and historical points of view. So I found out that basically, usually it's traditionally believed that the way for more openness and greater freedom of speech in Soviet media and Soviet television usually is associated exclusively with the reforms of perestroika since 1985. And usually they are personally associated with Gorbachev reforms. But I think, and in many ways, television is a very good source of talking about it, that the ground for these changes, which happened in the media sphere, in a glasnost policy, could be associated with even stagnation era. And basically, what I want to present is my research proposal, which I was working for several, years, because I was doing an archival research of my own, and also I was thinking a lot about it. So I think the very important thing that I'm totally open to any feedback, comments, questions, and contradictions, because for me it's important to find the proper optic and proper way of researching it. So the thing is that the Soviet television is a very complex phenomenon, because it was it has different eras throughout the times, and it was created as a experiment in back in even 30s, and up until the end of the 50s, it was still an experiment, because authorities they perceived television as a very expensive, not very popular way of communicating with the society. So and it was even obvious because of the name of the state ministry, which was in control of television, because it was called as a State Committee of Radio and Television up until the mid 60s or beginning of the 60s. So the crucial points in the history of television after the Second World War, I think it's 1958, because during the Youth Congress in Moscow, authorities they just understood that television is a very powerful tool for communicating not only with society but with the whole world. And before that, they were just thinking about the radio as a main source of a propaganda and entertainment and anything what matters to the authorities. So here you can see state order about the development of the television, and the idea was that the main idea of the television in the Soviet Union is propagating the any relevant for the communist society ideas, and even in this order, there are plenty of different programmatic things about how to program the Soviet television. But in how to say, an essence of this document was the propaganda of a communist society and its principles and any important and valuable ideas. So from the 60s, television was twofold. In some ways, it was an experiment because a lot of people, they were creating a profession of television journalists. They were trying to find formats which were existing in Western media, for example, in France or in United Kingdom, or in some ways in Italy. But on the other hand, the television was a media which was created for propaganda. So there were a lot of contradictions between these 2 points of using the television. And in some ways, Soviet television was similar to the television stations and television broadcasts organized back in France, any other Western European country. And from the archives, I saw that there were plenty of delegations from the Soviet television to the BBC, to the French state television, to the Italian state television, just to find technological and media ways of creating the television. And there were plenty, and considering propaganda, it was less experimentative because, for example, they were organizing propaganda campaigns through television as it was organized in radio. So they created a topic of different programs which could be created in different departments of the Soviet television, from, I don't know, agricultural up to educational, from political propaganda up to news department, and every department was sending their ideas about how to say something about the Congress, which provided some new ideas about how to organize agriculture in Soviet Union. And in the end, they have plenty of different programs, and it's difficult to say was it effective or not. But during the 60s, television was very vivid, very thriving, and a lot of journalists tried to be a journalist, even in this situation of propaganda aims and activities. In the end of the 60s, due to the Soviet invasion to Czechoslovakia, Soviet authorities understood that television is a very powerful and very dangerous tool, as they already understood it through the 60s. And the next era of stagnation, was basically organized along two different mainstream ideas. In the first place, the new executive of the Soviet television, Lapin, he decided that he wanted to make it very hierarchical. So he decided that journalist activities should be prohibited during the work of the Soviet news department and Soviet propaganda programs. And he basically changed the profession of journalist to the profession of speaker, who was just presenting the text, not of his own, but by editors of this program. And especially it was obvious during the broadcast of the Время time program, which was basically the main news and propaganda program during the day and during the week. But on the other hand, Lapin created many things which made the television very different from what authorities wanted to create. Understanding that the Soviet television basically they had at this point, in the beginning of the 70s, only one channel of broadcast, and in the 70s they created the second one. And understanding that the audience of the Soviet television is very big, and it's difficult to provide this audience only with the propaganda broadcasts, they created a lot of entertainment programs, from educational ones up to television quizzes, shows, musical programs, musical concerts. And of course, they also they created basically a movie studio, creating a lot of teleplays and television movies, which were created specifically for the television. And I think that it's interesting that trying to make television more controlled, to create possibilities for better propaganda on the Soviet audience, they somehow created the problem, because they wanted to reach a very wide and very broad audience, and that's why they needed a lot of entertainment and I don't know, watchable programs. It was always the case in the discussions of the State Committee, because they understood that in many ways the propaganda programs they created are very boring. Yeah, this problem was mentioned in many researchers about the Soviet television history, and this problem was always understood by all the executives and journalists, editors, any other workers. And during the 60s, they tried to do something with it. They reorganized several times Время time program. They created, I don't know, something like University of Millions. It was a program devoted to the discussing a history of the Communist Party and Leninism. They created some programs about the Soviet military, something like basically Soviet army. There was a broadcast during the 70s. But I think when the era of Lapin has ended in the middle of the 80s, and television became a part of new glasnost policy, there was a problem. Especially a problem for Gorbachev, because in the case of print media, it was to some extent understandable what is possible to do. There were several places which already had a reputation of being more liberal or more modern, something like it happened eventually during the perestroika with Ogonyok and with Moskovskое время. But in case of television, there were plenty of different thoughts about it. First of all, Soviet television was really, from one point of view, it was very hierarchical, and it was kind of a catch-them-all television in the context of the Soviet Union. And also it had a lot of regional branches with a different agenda in some ways. And also it was there was a memory that using a television as a place for freedom and free discussion is very dangerous idea. So the changes in the context of the Soviet television started later than in a case of print media. And that's basically where I'm seeing the point of interest and point of research in this case, because basically the idea to reorganize the Soviet television to make it more freer place was an idea of ministries and Politburo. But I think, and it's kind of, there are evidences of that, that the creation of these more freer spaces was up to the journalists themselves. A lot of people who were creating some important programs of perestroika era, basically they were the journalists whose careers started during the stagnation era. They had a lot of different ways of building this career, because some of them were working in a youth department, which during the 70s perceived as a non-important in a way of propaganda, but important in a way of creative thinking and presenting different difficult ideas which couldn't be presented in a mainstream broadcasting. Some of them were working in regional branches, like it was with I don't know, with the basically with all the people who were creating Leningrad television during the perestroika like Nevzorov or Belobrukova. And I think that studying this phenomenon of perestroika television, we can find the answers for several questions. First of all, and first of all of them, I think, is that the question, what was basically the role of this demand for changes from below? What was the role of Soviet journalists who were not illegal or dissident journalists, but they were practically legal journalists working on the Soviet television in an official institution? What was their role and how it was connected with any intentions of state authorities, of party authorities, and also from the audience? Because during the whole time of existence of the Soviet television, and especially in the 60s and 80s, the Soviet television executives, they were really interested in in a people's voice, because they had a special department dealing with any feedback, letters, and everything like that. And back in the 60s, they even organized kind of meetings with viewers, trying to understand what is interesting, what's not. They were organizing focus groups and something like that. So the thing is that I'm really interested how this hierarchically built propaganda machine, which was basically the idea of the Soviet television back in the 60s and 70s, how did it change and why, being a place for dialogue, being a place for different points of view during the second part of the 80s, and what was the role of the journalist? Is it possible to say that it was the journalists, not the executives, who decided to create, to find the probabilities and possibilities to create this place? Of course, television studies and Soviet television and socialist television studies are existing, and they are very well researched area and in nowadays. And especially there are several very good researchers about the Soviet television. And I think that, well, the thing is that despite decades of scientific research of the Soviet television and the Soviet media system as well, there is still a lack of research about this transition from propaganda media up to the media of dialogue, or kind of a polyphonic conversation, I think, because a lot of these things were happening at the same time. New broadcasts, new programs, which were devoted to this discussion or real social problems and social issues, from, I don't know, drug addicts up to the war in Afghanistan. But at the same time, even during the perestroika, there were plenty of broadcasts which were organized and created and produced like it was back in the 70s. So I think that there are several ways to analyze the Soviet television. First of all, we should understand that it's as Pereskanel, great researcher of television, said that television broadcasts itself is a continuous flow. And repeating Sabina Mihai idea, we need to also understand that the socialist television is a phenomenon which coexists with television as an idea, but it's in different context and in different social field and social structure. And trying to find the, I think, probable ways of analyzing the actions of Soviet executives and Soviet journalists. For me, it was interesting to use media theory proposed by Bourdieu, who was basically saying that any media is existing in a social field, and it's always in a constant connection with desires of people who are collaborating with this field in any way. And also, I found particularly important in this context an idea proposed by an anthropologist, Alexei Yurchak, the idea of hypernormalization, basically which describe us the state of the late Soviet society, in which the things are not going very well, but everybody is not going to say that it's going not very well, and it creates this situation of not even of a hypocrisy, but it's dual state when you understand that everything is rotten, but you cannot imagine the different situation. So I think for many journalists who were working during the stagnation era and even before, the situation with television was very similar to the ideas described by Yurchak, because they were working in the system. They had a memories of better times back in the 60s when many experiments were possible, and basically when they were created. And when they found this opportunity to create a new place and make a television a better media, they somehow changed themselves from the just speakers or very state-controlled journalists up to the independent journalists to some extent, because in any way all these perestroika broadcasts were controlled by the authorities, and it's interesting that they were basically created by the order of the authorities, like it was with Vzglad broadcast, which was basically the main broadcast about the perestroika and changes, and which up to some point became so popular and so independent that it was shut down by the authorities in the beginning of 1991. So I think it's also important to understand what was already said and wrote about the socialist television, and I highlighted several names. For example, Claudia Dittmar, studying the television in East Germany, she also pointed out to this thing with the entertainment and propaganda interrelation, and in the case of GDR, it was even more difficult, because Western German television was possible to watch probably everywhere in East Germany, not in Dresden, but in any other place it was possible, and authorities of executives of Eastern German television, they knew about it, and basically the whole programming of the television was created in this idea in mind. And also Christian Rotai, Christian Evans, they made a very great researches about the structural history of the Soviet television, and also about the propaganda as well. For example, Christian Rotai, she proposed a very interesting archival sources about the development of Vremya broadcast, because initially people who were creating this broadcast, they were thinking creating something like Western German news media, but due to the dislike of the Soviet authorities, they made it not very fast, not very short, but from different departments of the Soviet government, they received a lot of ideas how to make it longer, how to create a new formats like essays about the workers. So basically it wasn't the news media, it was a kind of a essayistic and columnistic propaganda media, and it happened not because of the desire of the journalists and editors, but because of the desire of government and desire of Lapin, the executive of the Soviet television, because he was thinking that transferring this format from the print media, it's possible to make something attractive on the Soviet television. So and in many ways, people who were working in the news department of the Soviet television in the end of the 80s and in the beginning of the 90s, they transferred the experience to the different television broadcast company of Russian television. And there was an opposition between Ostankina, which was basically the main point of work of every Soviet central television journalist, and Shabalovka, which is a different place. And at this point, it's a place where main government TV broadcast Russia have the headquarters. So, judging from these different ideas, especially from the idea proposed by Michael Keane about China state television nowadays, who proposed the idea that we need to approach this television not as a media, but as a kind of a focus group for government, which use the television as not only as a tool of entertainment, but as a tool for presenting some propagandistic ideas and finding feedback from the audience. Basically, the history of the Soviet television was to some extent presented by me, and if you have any questions, and you will have any questions, you can ask. Just to me being more short, and basically. Basically, I think that the contradiction in the development of the Soviet television, contradiction between the journalists, state actors, and the party and television itself, is interesting not only because it's a historical question of media development in the late Soviet Union, but also because it can help us to understand what was happening with television and media in post-Soviet Russian state and also in some other post-Soviet republics, because I think that this power relations between the journalists, society, and government was crucial in creating at one point very free and very complex dialogue, and also this success of the television as a media during the perestroika showed the authorities the, I think, boundaries which they should have in relation with Soviet television. Yeah, well, basically my proposal is about the starting of the last decade of the Soviet television, from the beginning, end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s up to the end of the 80s, because this decade was divided equally by the perestroika. It was full of different changes in Soviet television structure and Soviet television journalists' actions and ideas. And I think it's especially crucial to understand what happened with propaganda and how entertainment, programs which were created in the 70s, or not even entertainment but educational ones, how did they become a place, a space where a lot of authors and journalists who recreated the Soviet television in the end of the 80s, they came from, basically. And basically, in the end, I want to tell a bit about my methods in this research, and I think about some preliminary observations. I think that the best way to understand what was going on with the television in this case are in-depth interviews and oral histories from the journalists themselves, and plenty of them are very eager to talk about it and to talk about this experience, because it's I think it's interesting even for them, and I think it's a good way to understand what was going in a journalistic sphere. And also with an archival study, as I already mentioned, I made a part of it, considering the 60s and the 70s of the Soviet television, working in a state archive of Russian Federation, and it was interesting in a structural way of understanding how the television was controlled and organized by the authorities. And also, I think that in case of the Soviet television, it's important not only to talk with journalists and not only to read through the archives, but also use content analysis and from different point of view, because I think it's difficult to prove, but I think that cinematic methods of perestroika television, in some ways, they developed from the methods which were used back in the 70s, but they were using them not as a, I don't know, way of just presenting the story, but a way of dialogue. It's practically different way of creating the television, because they were using, for example, pop-up interviews, not in a way it was before. It wasn't this case when the people were telling, I don't know, prepared words and talking them to the camera and journalist, but it was a real live television, and that's why even I don't know, from the outsider point of view, it was practically the same, but in the essence, it was a totally different story, and that's why it's important to analyze. And also, I think that because most of these programs, especially the programs which were created in the second part of the 80s, they are not only possible to watch and to reach, but they also, in practically in all ways, they have a transcription. So I think it's possible to find a kind of a marker words which can highlight the changes of the narrative during the second part of the 80s. And I think that what was obvious from the archival study, it was inconsistency of the authorities considering the television. As I already mentioned, this the idea of the television was developing through time, even in minds of the Soviet executives, and people who were controlling the television, who were creating the organizational structure, they understood that as well. And in some ways, even in 60s and 70s, they decided to do something not by the order, but deciding to make an experiment, trying to find what is possible, what are boundaries on this day, what is maybe what could be done and in which way. And in the 80s, this practice practically became a norm, because when the television executive decided that they wanted to have a green light on a creation, for example, of Vzгляд, they didn't have any kind of instructions how to do this. It was a very vivid and very live process of finding the boundaries, finding what the free Soviet television could be the thing, and also trying to find a way in which it's possible to be an independent media, but working in a state-controlled organization, which basically the Central Soviet Television was. And I think it's important that even back in the 60s and 70s, television executives understood that the television exists not in a vacuum, but in a constant connection with the print media, with radio, and they were trying to somehow use the experience of the colleagues from the different departments of this ministry, trying to find how it's possible to work with an audience. And it's also obvious because, for example, I've read several reports about how the Central Television authorities were dissatisfied with the work, for example, of Kazakh Central Television, or I don't know, Uzbek, because they found out that in many ways, people who were executives in the Soviet republics, they were trying to use the experience of print media, for example, talking a lot about the history of Kazakh people. But when it was presented on a television in the end of the 60s, and Soviet authorities from Moscow saw this, they were furious because they perceived it as a nationalist propaganda, not a communist one. And after that, they practically reorganized the Kazakh Central Television, and Kazakh television executives were fired. So I think it's important to understand that it wasn't a monolith even before the 80s. They have a lot of different ways of working even within the system, and the possibility of creation of more freer place created new power relations dynamic, which was very, I think, important in the context of perestroika, and also it terrified the authorities. They decided to shut down a lot of programs, but in the end of it wasn't even possible to shut them down, because they decided, and they had an opportunities to broadcast from the underground, practically like it was with Vzгляд, which was shut down, but still was possible to make reports about the events in Vilnius in 1991. And then they just created an independent television company, which very fast became very popular, because they were not state controlled. Sorry for being a bit nervous. I think it was basically it is the end of my presentation and this proposal. So thank you for your attention. Mm-hmm.
Hello, thank you very much. Very interesting. I understand that you are right now, you're trying to find like maybe the best way to do the research on the topic.
Yeah, because well, some version of this proposal was proposed by me to the different institutions during this winter. They were unsuccessful, excepting one case, but yeah, I'm trying to do this.
From that point of view, my question is, well, usually when somebody is doing the research proposal, the first question would be methods.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see, like, how are you going to inquire? What are you going to basically maybe count, mm-hmm. or vice versa? Is it going to be quality for quantity for, how do you see the method section?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Well, as I said, I think that it's obviously a qualitative research, and I was thinking about archival study and in-depth interviews with the people who are practically the part of the Soviet television back in the 80s. So when I was mentioning something like content analysis, it's just, I think, a possible addition, because in the case of television, there are different ways how to use these methods, visually or textually. So I'm not yet have a, I think, strict adherence to these methods, but yeah, in-depth interviews and archival study.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this was very interesting and very enjoyable. I'll have sort of mixtures of kind of comments and questions, but I think the strongest bit, and this is the comment part, is yeah, focusing kind of on late Brezhnev and then Andropov as well, because I think there's a kind of a growing body of scholarship which is locating, you know, if not reforms themselves, then the roots of the reforms in this era. So you would definitely have stuff to do, stuff to work with from there, and also kind of a way to position yourself in something that is already like a rising body of literature, and you would also have materials to work on as secondary sources. So I like that very much. And I wanted to ask you basically, have you looked at the OSA in Budapest?
Yeah, they have a big archive of the Soviet television up to the 1991. Yeah.
Yeah, and they, you know, they do have these yearly scholarships as well. So if you want to spend like 2 months doing research there, you can get some free money to do it. So I think that's also a really great idea.
Thank you.
I also have a question. Thank you for the topic, which is relevant to everybody, probably who grew up in the Soviet Union and the Soviet times. And personally, I remember how they changed in the 1980s was happening. My question is related to the to the level, to the degree of openness to of the late Soviet television to the to the content from other countries, from abroad. For example, movies and cartoons. But particularly, I remember, like, I grew up with those cartoons that were imported basically by the Soviet television from different countries, and I remember different iterations of them, like from the Soviet bloc, from the Eastern Bloc countries, later the cartoons from different Western countries like Canada and US. But is it possible today to restore and to calculate the amount of such, I would say, interventions, such, well, because the broadcasting time was quite limited, and the amount of movies, cartoons that was broadcasted. Is it possible to restore the quantitative?
Well, it's totally possible because broadcast programs and schedules of the Soviet television, they are well, they exist in the archives, so you can just check them through the archives and understand every day of the Soviet broadcasting. But it depends on the region, and in some ways regional schedules could be different from the central ones. But I also think it's important that in the case of the Soviet television, comparing it with the televisions of the socialist countries in Eastern and Central Europe, it was different in a way of importing media, because in socialist countries there were more imported broadcasts and programs, and it was in this amount of programs was bigger during the 60s and 70s and 80s, and it wasn't the case. But it's interesting that back in the 60s Soviet television was prone to openness. For example, they were discussing very properly the idea of creating mutual broadcast from BBC to the Soviet Union and from practically Soviet Central Television to the BBC. They discussed this idea, and they also had a kind of agreements that it couldn't be used in a propaganda of political ideas and something like that. But after the end of the 60s, up until the end of 80s, I think, the imported amount of programs and broadcast was really limited. And even in a case of exchange of programs and broadcasts with socialist countries, they had this department. It wasn't really very active, but they tried to do their best. Yeah. So answering your question, yeah, it's possible because we have the schedules.
Are there any research?
I don't remember about this one, but I saw researchers about the percentage of imported broadcasts in the socialist countries.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Yeah, of course, this is just proposal, but still there are two questions which are relevant to the proposal. The first one, television is really a very powerful propaganda tool, but not only in the Soviet Union. It was propaganda tool in many other countries, and it is still propaganda tool even in the Western countries. So, and basically that is the main explanation why Italy, France, United Kingdom, and many other countries, why do they have state channels? So basically that is the main explanation. So the first question is, can you say that the Soviet shift in the television, which started in the 1960s, as you said, do you think that that was some kind of unique movement, or basically something similar was observed also in other countries, like in Western countries?
This change in the 80s, right? Not in the 60s.
In the 60s, because you said that basically until the 60s there was one period, after the 60s there was another period, then the third period started in 1975 and so on. Would you say that it was really unique, or something similar could be observed in Western countries as well? So that is the first question. And the second question, if we are talking about the perestroika time, do you think maybe there are some market factors, some economic factors that played really major role in the alterations of the Soviet television? Like if you want to get something from the market, you need to have something to sell, because it was impossible to sell сельский час or village hour. Nobody ever watched the сельский час, so you couldn't sell it. And basically, it would be the main driving force behind these processes that were absorbed during the perestroika time.
Thank you. Well, I think answering on the first one, it's impossible to compare in this way the Soviet and socialist television with the Western one, because the organization and structure organization of the Western European television wasn't so hierarchical. They had boards, they had a lot of society organizations, and also they had from the 70s, they had possibilities to create independent and private television broadcast.
Yes, but the question is not about television in general. The question is about state television channels. Not about television in general, but state television channels, like RAI in Italy.
Well, honestly, I think that during the 70s, the trajectory and of the Soviet government television and the Western European one was different, because in the 70s, state television in Western Europe, they decided to create more entertainment programs, and it was their position, because they needed to somehow to be successful. And the idea was that they needed more entertainment programs, and they created different channels, even in France and Italy. Well, in the Soviet case, I think that the real trajectory was also about entertainment, but the idea and the kind of a principle was about the state, more strict control of the propaganda and more about propaganda. And so I think in essence, they were similar, but they were different because of the ideas to have this transition.
The question was mainly about the patterns, like you said, that they were moving from purely propaganda to entertainment. So what about state televisions in the West? Because if we're talking about German, for example, case, then in Germany, Eastern German were more entertainment than Western German. However, Eastern German was a socialistic state. It was a part of the communist camp, when Western Germany was not. But Eastern Germany television was more entertainment than Western Germany television.
No, it wasn't more entertainment. It was more entertainment during the weekends, because they needed somehow to attract the people behind in front of the television sets. So they created a lot of entertainment programs. And some of them are still existing, but they were broadcasting them on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But other days were more or less propagandistic. But I'm not sure that it's possible to somehow equalize the propaganda programs and state programs which were created in a socialist European countries and the Soviet Union with a kind of a state news and state broadcasts which were created in Western European countries, because practically the problem was that Soviet journalists, even in the 60s, even before the 1968, they were operating in very much stricter conditions. They were controlled in many ways by the authorities, which practically wasn't the case, for example, in the case of the United Kingdom. Of course, BBC is not a state television, it's public television, but anyway. But I'm not sure that it's possible to see these state televisions in the similar context, because the context of media itself and media sphere in the Western Europe and the Soviet Union was totally different. So we can find some similarities, but I'm not thinking that it's a part of the same process. And well, yeah. And second question was about. Yeah, I think to some extent it's true, because I understood that the propaganda broadcasts as well as themselves were boring, and they knew it. So they needed just something to show which could be popular among the people. But I think that the problem is boundaries of this freedom and boundaries of this entertainment, which what is possible in creating this, for example, I don't know, что, где, когда, what, where, how, what was possible, and what was the boundaries of freedomness in this case. I think it was up to the journalists and to some extent editors of these broadcasts. But yes, of course, to some extent it was the real idea behind these changes. They just needed something to watch. And for example, in Eastern Germany, it was openly stated by the Honecker, who in the beginning of 70s said that the Eastern German television is boring to watch even for him. So that's why the changes started in the 70s in the GDR in case of television. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, another question would be, maybe I understood that not correctly, but when you're talking about propaganda, you mostly base your conclusion on news programs like Time, like Время. Yes, and maybe comparing, well, what can you say about hidden propaganda, the propaganda that is not on the news, but somehow, you know, embedded in edutainment, you know, so it's not like just directly speaking about something, but, you know, the bottom line, something that is not that visible, but just, it's just there, and some, just entertainment programs, they basically have that element.
Yes, sure, and it's a problem, and that's why I think it's important to have some methods like content analysis, or visual or textual ones, because of course, in many ways, when we are talking about any Soviet television broadcasts, you can find it even in the documentaries about, I don't know, nature. You can find a lot of thoughts or ideas, but I think that initially it's probably better to start from the big departments of the propaganda, and then just to proceed to this inner essence of propaganda in different cases. So yeah, I understood this problem, but I think I need to find a way to somehow deal with it, because for example, I don't know, there is an interesting phenomenon in the context of the Soviet television and Soviet film broadcasts, advertisement. It existed. It was, in some cases, it was a department of, it was basically, in some ways, it was television advertisement, and in some cases, it was film advertisement, which we are showing during the screenings or before the screenings. And to some extent, it was a very, well, it was propaganda because it is an advertisement, but it was totally free of any communist propaganda. It was propaganda, for example, of I don't know, a bank system and how to use it properly, or for example, of new products which were created by the Soviet factories. So I think that there are different kind of islands in this system of film and television films productions. So yeah, I understood this problem, and I need to find a way how to deal with it.
Well, maybe just, you know, the remark, because what you are trying to research gives me some association with, you know, Generation P, 11, because they are basically there. They are not selling whatever. We are selling patriotism or whatever. So you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
so,
I think.
So can you relate to that somehow?
Well, it's interesting that when I was thinking about this idea as an idea for a non-fiction book, I was talking a lot with the people from Ostankino who were working back in the 80s or 90s, or some of them are working now. And it's interesting that even now, they do not perceive themselves in Ostankino working in different channels, whatever they are. They perceive them as Ostankino, not as a television channel. They do not perceive them as a member of, I don't know, NTV or Russia or culture or something other. They even tell about themselves as a member of Ostankino, the whole this television thing. So I think it's a, I think basically it's a problem with the post-Soviet Russian televisions, that the people who were creating this television, in many ways, they were from this system. And even now, they think of them as a member of this big central unit, not as a, I don't know, member of this versatile area where they can compete with each other. Yep.
If I'm allowed to ask one more question, the structure of Soviet press was defined by the central authorities. And the structure of Soviet television, as far as I could understand, was also defined by the central authorities. But I understand, I remember from my childhood that by the end of 1980s, the regional television, I mean, not from the Soviet republics, but the regional television on the level of Krai, Oblast, was developing pretty well, and they were growing their own teams. They had, they still were part of that VGTRK, as far as I remember, the abbreviation, but they could produce pretty quality content. My question is whether such regional television, not companies, but branches of the central television, they existed at the same, they evolved simultaneously, or were there more or less progressive regions of the Soviet Union where they developed it earlier? And one more specific question, were there any examples on the lower level, like municipal level? Because I remember that in 1990s, the municipal level of television companies existed. They bought very basic studios and started broadcasting in 1990s. And in 1980s, it was only regional, or maybe there were some cases.
I think the thing is that during the 80s, during the perestroika, and talking in a political science terms, the democratic breakthrough happened. The democratic breakthrough happened in the structure of the Soviet television, because basically it was fractured on Ostankino and Shabulovka, and basically the VGTRK in the end of the 80s was an opposition media, which was saying about themselves as a kind of a BBC in Russia and in Soviet Union, and Ostankino was this I don't know, monolith of authority and something like that. And I think to some extent in the 90s this dynamic existed, because the channel 1, the successor of the Soviet Central Television, became a very important asset in the hands of pro-state, pro-governmental businessmen, and VGTRK, being a state media, to some extent it wasn't really popular, but it was more opposition than in many ways to the government than, for example, Channel 1 or NTV. So I think the reason behind it lies in a, I don't know, in a capital infrastructure of these branches, because honestly, I don't know how they were reorganized in the beginning of 90s, but up until the end of the Soviet Union, they were parts of Soviet Central Television, and they were very well controlled. So I think that what you were referring to, it's a legacy of this context of the late perestroika, when two different television organizations were competing with each other.
Thank you.
Well, I think that's it.
Thank you very much.